Hello and welcome to this week's video looking at Van Gogh and his painting methods or systems. This is the final week that we're going to be looking at Van Gogh, and this week I've left probably the most beguiling aspect of Van Gogh's work until this week, until this last part, which is his use of colour. He's most well known for his vibrant yellows and rich reds and greens, but there are very specific ways that he's using colour, and they developed throughout those 10 years of him painting, from the very early years, very lush, what you could say they're drab colours, but very dark paintings to begin with. Using lots of ochres and black, and then it was when he's moved to Paris in about 1885, 1886, where he becomes exposed to the Impressionist colours, that you see that explosion of colours that he then used principally for that painting period down in the south of France around Arles during 1888. 1889. He used his colours, as I said, in very specific ways, using complementary pairs, analogous groupings, and developed a very keen sense of how to use these colours. Along with that exposure to the Impressionist palette, that is using brighter colours, was his colour experience expanded when he really started to collect Japanese prints, and he was attracted to their bold use of flat areas of colour, and he did quite a few copies of Japanese prints, exploring not only compositional elements like the outline that you see, but often those trees going from outside of the edge of the picture plane across the picture plane and out again. So there were some compositional devices that he did take from the Japanese, but it was really those flat, broad areas of colour surrounded by the outlines that he really started to focus in on and use that idea. Of course, in the Japanese prints they can have slight graduations, etc. And he didn't completely flatten his colours like they did. He would then start to use interesting ideas which we're going to explore within those flat areas of colour, to make them more vibrant, to have greater movement, to have greater vitality. To begin with, let's have a bit of a look at the colour palette that Van Gogh was using, or may have been using. Now, some of the colours that he would have used are no longer available, simply because they've been worked out that they are not stable. So things like chrome yellow was probably the colour he used and is most well known for. But it very quickly became realised that colour would that colour would darken and start to take on a greeniness to it, which has affected a lot of Van Gogh's paintings. We don't see them necessarily as yellow as they once were. They sometimes have a particularly greenness to them. This is most well known in terms of his sunflower paintings. But our modern day equivalent, and which had started to become available in his lifetime, is cadmium yellow. So that's that first colour that you're seeing here. He may have used other variations of cadmium yellow. So this is cadmium yellow medium, cadmium yellow pale, etc. were also available. But you're not actually, because it's the same pigment across the whole thing, it's very difficult to test his paintings to know exactly which of the cadmiums he would have used, or which of the chromes he would have used. And again, there were the same variances of light and dark of chrome yellow as well. But in terms of if replicating, cadmium yellow like that is a good starting point. The next colour along here that you can see is yellow ochre. Van Gogh did continue to use a lot of earth colours, unlike some of the other Impressionists, which abandoned most of the earth colours. But he did continue to use a few earth colours in his paintings, yellow ochre being one of them. He may have also used raw sienna as well, which is similar, a little bit darker. The next colour here is vermilion, this one here, which is a beautiful hot red-orange, or orangey red. It's a very delicate colour. It's quite transparent, and is very subtly, it mixes with other colours, produces lovely violets and things. That next colour that you can see there is alizarin crimson, or permanent matter deep in Rembrandt. This replaces a lot of the red lakes, was the term used in Van Gogh's time. These are very transparent, dark reds. He would also use colours called red earths. So this does include the family of things like burnt umber, raw, well, yes, raw umber probably, but not so much, but burnt umber, burnt sienna, etc. Indian red. But I'm going to use here, and what I have used here, is light oxide red, which is probably the most similar. When you look at a lot of Van Gogh paintings, this is probably very similar to the type of earthy red that he used in his paintings. The next colour, which you don't often see in his paintings, but he did apparently use it, and is a very popular colour with the Impressionists, is cobalt violet. We then move into the blues, starting with ultramarine blue, cobalt blue, and Prussian blue. And then we move into these interesting greens here. Now, this first green is probably one of the most popular greens and was very much used by the Impressionists, and that's a colour called emerald green. At the time that they were using it, it was made using derivatives of cyanide, so it was a very dangerous colour to use. The ones that we have today don't include cyanide in them, but are very close to this sort of cool yellow green that you often see used very purely in a lot of Impressionist paintings. Two other greens that he may have used, which are really gorgeous, is this one here called cobalt green. And you do see him using a lot of that in quite a few of his paintings, still lifes, etc. And the last one there, viridian green, is another very common colour that you see in Van Gogh paintings. The other aspect that we need to take into consideration is his use of two different whites too. He would have been using flake white, which of course is a lead-based pigment, which we don't have as much access to today, and I'd encourage you not to use it. So I mean, the closest equivalent to that, of course, is titanium white, which I have opened up all of the colours that I've just previously mentioned here with titanium white. But the other white that he used often was this one here, zinc white. Now, zinc white is a cooler white, and it's a much more transparent white. So, and it's often called tinting white because of those two characteristics. It means when you add it with your other colours, it isn't as strong as titanium, and it doesn't overwhelm the colours as quickly as what titanium does. So you can see here in the yellow how very quickly the titanium takes over, even in that first little step. Using zinc white instead, it's a much more smoother transition, and the yellow remains for a lot longer. And particularly when you're using it with colours like cobalt or vermilion, which don't have a lot of tinting strength, you can see the colour stays in there a lot longer when you use zinc white. The tints are softer. So it was a very popular colour for that reason, and may be His reason for using it is because of the greater subtlety that you could get with your mixes. The first concept we're going to introduce in terms of Van Gogh's use of colour is his use of analogous colours, and how he would group certain colours together to create certain effects. So analogous colours is when you use a segment of the colour wheel. Usually it will be one colour and it's two adjacent colours, for instance. So they would be an analogous grouping, but sometimes it can be between 3 to 5 colours as a segment of the colour wheel grouped together. It's then any variations of those colours. So say, for instance, if we thought about maybe that segment from blue through to yellow, it's those colours and it's any of those colours. So we can be using different blues, and I'm just going to paint down patches to demonstrate this. So it'll, the very abstract nature of how this works. And we've got to remember, I mean, Van Gogh, not only would he be mixing colour, he's also using those colours as they are coming out of the tube. So this is where those greens, etc., are very important. And that we can then start to alter those greens. So that I've just mixed some Viridian initially there just with white, but if we start to then add some of our cadmium yellow to that, of course we want to open it up with white as well. And a bit more white. So as I said, this is just, we're talking in just abstractly how these colours respond and work together. We might just go in with a couple of other patches of darker blue. We might come in there with another green as well, so I'm going to come in here with a little bit of emerald green. just a few places. And the last one to think about adding in is a little bit of yellow. So now what I'm going to do here to the yellow is very much like what Van Gogh would do. So I'm not going to add any of that yellow in as full strength as it comes out of the tube. We're going to add quite a bit of white to it and lighten it right up wherever we add it. So there you can see that's an analogous grouping of colour, of working from yellow through to blue, and you can see how they hang together when you work in a segment like that, and that it works really well. And it can be any mixes of those. You can be mixing those blues and greens together and adding them in and creating a pattern like that. So it's a grouping of those colours that we're using, any of the mixes of those colours, and of course opening them up with white to create tints of them and changing them that way. So you can see in this example I haven't added any of the yellow straight out of the tube. It's just been those pale ones. Of course you can add a stronger yellow and that will change the mood. If I just put a dab of that in there, you can see how maybe that started to enliven what we're looking at there. The last aspects that we're going to look at in terms of Van Gogh and his use of colour is inherent there with his mark making, in terms of his use of dots and dashes and what he would do with some of those dots and dashes. And this comes to using complementary colours. So the classic complementary colours that we know when we look at these colour wheels are things like yellow and violet, orange and blue, and red and green. They're the three classic complementary pairs, but any colours opposite one another on the colour wheel will be complementary. So when you put these colours together, they enhance one another. They bring out the best aspects of each other. So if we start with a classic example of just the violet and yellow pair, they not only work together, but they start to make each other vibrate and do some interesting things as well. But they can further be improved than just as they come out of the tube like that by altering aspects of them, by altering the tone of them. So for instance, with the yellow, if we start to lighten the yellow, as often is the case in a lot of Van Gogh paintings, and we then try to match the tone of that with our violet, so that our yellow and our violet are very similar in tone. So that means we're going to add quite a bit of white to that violet. paint that down. Now you can see there what starts to happen is they start to behave in quite a different way when you're getting the tone of them the same. Particularly when you stand back at a distance from them, they may start to merge together and start to appear more grey or more light-filled. And this is some of the concepts of what Van Gogh observed, and some of then the influence of people like the Neo-Impressionists, people like Seurat, Pissarro, who were in around 1888 starting to play and explore some of the techniques of putting dots and dashes, mark making, which was very much what Van Gogh was into, but putting complementary pairings together like this to create the illusion of light and brightness. So we see Van Gogh start to do things like this. He would start to put complementary pairs like this over areas to give them a vibrancy, to give them movement, to give them some activity, visual activity. But he would also, within areas, paint and use complementary. So, for instance, a classic example, if I start to make sort of a nice orange out of yellow ochre and some vermilion, and I'll touch it with a little bit of white just to open up the colour slightly. And let's say we'll put down a series of marks like this. I'll just leave a few areas open. So that you're able to get some colour down in between. So there we've sort of got an earthy orange. He would then place down in amongst those marks, once he'd painted that area quite flatly like that, there might be a little bit of variance. He might start to include a little bit of yellow ochre into it, a little bit like what we were doing before, painting in maybe a bit of a stronger vermilion here and there. So that analogous grouping. But then in amongst that, and remember, you know, with orange, the opposite to orange on the colour wheel is blue. He wouldn't put blue in a very, very strong tone. It would be quite pale or matching that tone. I think that's a little pale. I need to come back up to about there. So I'm just going to come in with some not cobalt, ultramarine. That might be a little bit too pale though, Brian. That's better. And you can see there immediately with those few marks how that orange has started to come more alive and have a sense of maybe more movement, or it stopped just being a flat area of colour. And sometimes too starts to change them and make them look slightly grey. Particularly that's what, you know, with his mark making and the way that he applied the paint, you start to get those more natural neutral greys. He often talked about grey in his letter and the importance of those subtle colours in the landscape and observing those. And this is him tapping into some of those ideas of using quite pure colours and combining them together to create light. Further to that, we need to sometimes, and this is probably observed quite often in his use of two, or a particular colour scheme, that of yellow and blue. And you see that with a lot of Impressionists' works as well. And this fits into a little bit, and he would use this idea, but not to, I'll say, the extent of what artists like Seurat would do. But those artists, they abandoned this type of colour wheel with these complementary pairings, and they started to use a slightly different colour wheel which had its relationship to the spectrum of light and the way that light has its primary colours. So the primaries of the light wheel are blue, red and green, producing secondaries of yellow, a magenta type sort of colour, and cyan. Now what then happens is that the opposites is that blue and yellow suddenly become opposite one another on the colour wheel. This creates, and so because as I said, this is to do with the way that light is, so when you add blue and yellow together in terms of light, you get white, purity, bright light. So the Impressionists or the post-Impressionists like Seurat knew about this, and that's what you see in some of their paintings, that they would be using that type of colour wheel and commonly using the combination of blue and yellow together to create a bright lightness in their work. And as I said, Van Gogh, I think, was aware of some of these ideas. So what you can do as an experiment to see this working is that I'm going to get a very pale yellow and just put down a series of dots of that. And then in amongst that, a very, very pale blue. Of the same tone. That's better. And the two mixed together and looked at from a distance start to have quite a bright lightness to them. You can start to, if you start to change the tone of that blue, something interesting starts to happen. You start to see the yellow dots more. If we start to get quite dark, but there is an appearance of quite bright light in this area here, and in intensity. And that's, as I said, was Van Gogh, I think, was aware of the possibilities of this intense and the inherent beauty of that pairing. We do see yellow and blue being paired quite a lot in interior design, etc., etc., and paired because of when they are put together, they do have a feeling of light and coolness and expansiveness. Which, as I said, is why I think a lot of the Impressionists and Van Gogh was very attracted to that grouping. So for this week's exercise, what I would like you to do is I want you to go through a similar process to what we have done in previous weeks. This week, I'm happy for you to use whatever subject matter you like. You don't have to stick to a landscape anymore. I'm quite happy for you. I want you to be starting to look at some Van Gogh pictures, be looking at his portraits, looking at his still life, and seeing how he would use these aspects that we've talked about in terms of using complementary colours and the dashes and dots of those complementary colours within those contexts of those different genres. So it gives you the opportunity, if you're interested more in still life or if you're interested more in portraiture, to start to include some of these ideas in your work or in the work that you'll do for this exercise. So first of all, your own subject matter in any genre. I still want you to go through a similar process to what we have been in the last couple of weeks. I think it would be a good idea to start with a drawing of it, thinking about mark making, thinking about the visual textures, the contrasts, the movement that you're seeing within whatever you're looking at. And this could be quite useful in terms of with a portrait or a still life, in terms of that you might not be able to spend that much time with the motive, so setting up paints and all the rest of it. So good starting with a very basic drawing, or not a basic drawing, but with a drawing to begin with. Make sure when you're thinking about that drawing is that you are thinking about the mark making that maybe you would do in the painting. Then follow on, like we have last week, with keeping that paint nice and rich, bodied, like I said, using small brushes again, but this time also start to maybe incorporate and think about some of the colours here that Van Gogh would use, particularly if you have access to some of those greens, etc. Now, if you don't have colours like emerald green, viridian is often a colour that you may have access to, or phthalo green, you might have a tube of that, and that would be a good substitute, that you're using those pure colours straight out of the tube rather than mixing some of these secondary colours like your greens and violets, etc. The same again with cobalt violet. It's not necessarily a colour that you're going to have, but you may have another violet that you could try using. Keep it as close to those palettes of colours as you can. Don't necessarily have to use all the blues either. Again, you might just have cobalt and Prussian, or ultramarine and Prussian. Prussian is probably a very important colour. You do see that pop up consistently through Van Gogh's palette. And don't forget to incorporate maybe a few earth colours like the yellow ochre or the red earth in your mixes. Good luck. Don't this next week worry too much about getting it done. I'd like to see maybe this exercise maybe take a couple of weeks. We might take a slight break from a video of painting this week, I think, before we go into the next artist. So this exercise might take you the next couple of weeks. Don't rush it. Slow down. So for this week, in terms of Zoom classes, maybe you might just get as far as having done a drawing, maybe with some colour notes or something like that, maybe the beginning of experimenting, or some experiments like I've done today, putting colours together. Good luck, and I look forward to seeing you in our Zoom meetings this week.